In July 2003, Dr. Andrews addressed the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., in the U.S., speaking about the future of South Africa under the topic, South Africa's Third Age, What Lies Ahead? And here is part of what Dr. Andrews said. And quote, the period since the 1994 transition can be divided into two ages. The first lasted from about 1994 to 2007. The second age started around 2008, and we're now at the tail end of it. The two ages reveal themselves clearly in South Africa's development indicators. I will describe for you some of the development indicators, and then we'll speak about what lies ahead for South Africa as it moves out of the second age into its third age. And he continued, South Africa's first age, from 1994 to 2007, was marked by considerable progress across a range of indicators. That GDP grew at an average rate of 3.6%. The number of people with jobs increased from 8 million to 14 million. And the average GDP per capita increased almost by 40%, from 55,000 per year to 76,000 per year in real terms, after adjusting for inflation. Unquote. I will now add further remarks concerning the period Dr. Andrews characterizes as our country's first age, and thank Dr. Franz Cronje for his assistance in this regard. Our gross domestic product per capita measured in real terms grew from under 65,000 in 1994 to nearly 80,000 towards 2008. The fixed investment rate rose quickly almost between 1998 and 2008, almost reaching the rising global average. At the same time, our country's investment competitiveness ranking improved to reach a ranking between roughly between 37 and 4th most competitive investment destination in the world. The public debt levels inherited from the apartheid administration at just below 45% of GDP were cut to a low of nearer 23% by 2007. And accordingly, as interest payments were reduced, the savings were reallocated to service delivery improvements and the very necessary social protection system. And the national data in the period up to 2007 collectively marked progress in advancing living standards that would rival any other post-colonial emerging market. And using various studies, there is little doubt that substantial strides have been made in reducing poverty since 1994, whether using a money metric measurement or a multidimensional poverty measure. And although South Africa has made progress in reducing poverty since 1994, the trajectory of poverty reduction was reversed between 2011 and 2015, threatening to erode some of the gains made since 1994. And after the 1998 Asian economic crisis, the GDP growth rate rose steadily to average over 5% between 2004 and 2007. And this was the first time that level of economic growth had been maintained for that number of years since the first half of the 1960s. And one important result of the pursuit of the correct macroeconomic policies was that the government achieved the very first sustained budget surpluses since the formation of the Union in 1910. And everything I've just said, confirms exactly what Dr. Andrews said, that South Africa's first age from 1994 to 2007 was marked by considerable progress across a range of indicators. And then Dr. Andrews went on to say, and I quote, by contrast, for the period 2008 to 2022, the average GDP growth was lackluster at 1.2%. The number of people with jobs increased by merely 1 million over a period of 14 years. while the population grew by 10 million over the same period. GDP per capita declined by 1,600 rand as people became poorer in real terms. The unemployment rate crept up over the years and now sits, this was last year, at an astonishing 32.9%, up from 22% in 2008, or 42.4% on the expanded definition that includes discouraged job seekers. Even these bleak employment numbers are generously assessed as they include both formal and informal employment. And he went on to say business indicators show a similarly stark divide. The RMB-BAR Business Confidence Index registered above the confidence indicating 50 mark in 7 out of the 14 years of the first stage on a rising trend, but has been below 50, showing lacking confidence every single year since 2008. Investment trends are downwards, with gross capital formation as share of GDP climbing during the first stage, reaching a level of 21.6% in 2008, before declining in the second stage, dropping to as low as 13.1% in 2022. This number should be around 24% for an emerging market like South Africa, and the government's 2012 National Development Plan specified a target of 30%. And it continues that the lack of investment by the private and public sector has started affecting the infrastructure that forms the backbone of the economy, of the country's economic activity. With dramatic deterioration, while dramatic deterioration is being recorded in road, rail, ports, and water infrastructure, the sector that has attracted the greatest attention is, of course, electricity generation. While the total amount of electricity produced rose from 170 terawatt hours in 1994 to 253 terawatt hours in 2007 during the first stage, an increase of 49%. It declined from there to barely 2009 terawatt hours in 2020, a drop of almost 18%, unquote. This sharp difference, I must say, colleagues, I'm sorry to have read you all of these figures. You will see that when you see the document, you will be able to manage them, to cope with all of them. But this sharp difference between Dr. Andres's ages 1 and 2 poses the question, why? An answer to this question becomes especially important because during both ages, the ANC was the major governing party. Before I deal with this important matter, I'd like briefly to refer to a central issue which Dr. Andres does not discuss. And during his age 1, our country adopted 2 constitutions in 1993 and 1996. It was therefore during this age 1, between 1994 and 2007, that especially the executive and the legislature, supported by the judiciary, set about establishing the institutions prescribed by these two constitutions. And these institutions include the Constitutional Court, the Independent Electoral Commission, Public Protector, the Gender Commission, and other Chapter 9 institutions. This also means that the necessary statutes were passed legally to establish these institutions. And other legislation was also approved to repeal a wide spectrum of apartheid laws and thus establish a truly democratic, non-racial, and non-sexist national statutory framework. In summary, in addition to the socio-economic progress made during Dr. Andres's age 1, we also owe to the democratic order we enjoy today to the work that was done during the same period, 1994 to 2007. This brings us back to what I said earlier. The sharp difference between Dr. Andres's ages 1 and 2 poses the question, why? And the answer to this question becomes especially important because during both ages, the ANC was a major governing party. Two important changes took place during the period 2007-2008. One economic and exogenous, and the other political and endogenous. The political change was more important of these. During the years 2008-2009, the world economy suffered a recession as a result of the banking crisis which started in the United States in 2008 with the collapse of the major bank Lehman Brothers, which filed for bankruptcy on the 15th of September 2008. And that global crisis resulted in our country losing 1 million jobs, and the damage could have been worse. And fortunately, during this period, we're investing in infrastructure in good measure to prepare for the 2010 Soccer World Cup. In addition, were the budget surpluses which enabled government to engage in counter-cyclical measures. Other things being equal, like other emerging economies, our country could have recovered from the economic recession fairly quickly. However, other things were not equal, centrally because of the endogenous political changes to which I have referred. As recently as 2 years ago, in April 2022, the online journal Politics Web published an article by the eminent African academic and intellectual Herman Gilliomir entitled "When the ANC Lost Its Brain." And this provides a clue to the political change I have mentioned. All of us are familiar with the concept of the Rooi Gevaar, which was strongly advanced by the apartheid regime and establishment. In his treatise, Afrikaner Anti-Communist History Production in South African Historiography, Wessel Visser has written that in the 1950s, Piet Meyer published a pamphlet containing a concise history of communist activity in South Africa. The cover page displayed an ominous specter of a Bolshevist looming like a giant over a Christian city in South Africa. Wielding a hammer and a sickle, the giant went about destroying the city. And Meyer illustrated how this South African Communist Party's policy was repeatedly defined and dictated by Moscow. And in his book, The Red Trap, Communism and Violence in South Africa, Chris Vermaak, a South African security police officer, asserted that a Soviet-inspired communist plot was being hatched to foster anti-apartheid sabotage, subversion, and revolution in South Africa. And he said agents of the SACP infiltrated organizations like the National Union of South African Students, the ANC Mkhonto weSizwe, South African Congress of Trade Unions, and even the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. And according to this historiography, the objectives of the Freedom Charter, quote, carried the unmistakable stamp of communism as the SAP acted in international cohesion with Russia. And this document went on to say from the 1970s onwards, South Africa was now being perceived by the West from its strategic global position vis-à-vis Soviet and Chinese strategic intentions. And the discourse of the anti-communist publications of this period shifted accordingly from the Red Peril inside South Africa to the Soviet and Red Chinese menace and expansionism in African states bordering white South Africa. And elsewhere, Taryn Halsall and Johan Wasserman wrote that in the apartheid-era textbooks, in line with the political ideology of the National Party and within the context of the Cold War, Russia and communism was a red peril. Communism was foregrounded as a threat to especially capitalism and the white way of life. And Wessel Visser said that the average white South African, especially during the period 1974 to 84, was imbued with the psychosis of a fear of a worldwide communist threat. In January 2010, the Financial Times published an article by Alec Russell entitled Lunch with the FW de Klerk. And the article said that, encouraged by the fall of the Berlin Wall, which took away the Roy Gevaar, or fear of a communist takeover, de Klerk was emboldened to press ahead with changes which led to the end of apartheid rule, unquote. The hard reality, however, is that not everybody in the apartheid establishment took this position concerning the Roy Gevaar. For instance, in his book, The Afrikaner's Biography of a People, Herman Gilliome writes, and I quote, "To preserve its image as a national movement, the ANC, as distinct from the South African Communist Party, did not commit itself to a socialist state. Instead, nationalists and communists alike propounded the theory of a national democratic revolution. In the first stage of this revolution, the goal was to take charge of the political and economic system, and from this basis, create the conditions for the transfer to socialism, which was to be the second stage." The author then says that wanting to put all his efforts into the NDR's first phase, Mbeki, quote, "postponed the introduction of socialism indefinitely," unquote. You will understand from this quotation that to this day, sections among the old apartheid establishment continue to hold this entirely false view that the NDR, the fundamental policy of the ANC, is in fact an old communist policy. The argument states that the communists prescribed this NDR for countries emerging out of colonial domination, this being the first step on the road to socialism. Later, those leading the NDR would then take the next step, the introduction of socialism. It was exactly on this basis that Professor Gilliome wrote the article headed "When the ANC Lost Its Brain." And specifically he wrote, quote, "The ideology of the SACP was very close to that of the Soviet Union. And the SACP dominated the ANC-SACP alliance during the years of struggle. And the ANC's intimate relationship with the SACP and its association with Moscow have acquired something of a smell. It is clear that the paralysis that has seemed to grip the ANC government is due largely to the decline of communism as an ideology and the cessation of the flow of expert advice from Moscow." And quote, President Cyril Ramaphosa's appeals to his voters sounds increasingly like calls to stragglers who have lost, who are lost and without guidance, unquote. These comments communicate the convictions of those unlike F.W. de Klerk, who never believed that the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the disappearance of the Soviet Union meant an end to the Roy Gevaar in South Africa. To the contrary, South Africa still had the SACP-dominated ANC, intent to advance from the NDR to socialism, regardless of the fact that it was experiencing some paralysis because it had lost its real brain, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and was therefore without guidance because of the cessation of the flow of expert advice from Moscow. Earlier, I quoted some analysts as having written that during the apartheid years, communism was foregrounded as a threat to especially capitalism and the white way of life. And this is exactly how those who were and are convinced that the NDR is a communist strategy leading to socialism understood the threat posed by the electoral victory of the ANC in 1994, that it would establish a system which was, quote, a threat especially to capitalism and the white way of life, unquote. And this threat had to be defeated. And it was exactly to realize the strategic objective that the group emerged from among especially the erstwhile apartheid security forces centered on the former military intelligence division of the SADF, whose objective was to ensure the defeat of the ANC, whose NDR and other policies continue to perpetuate the Roy Gefar. And this group was the leader and practical expression of the counter-revolution whose activities we will now discuss. And one of the important decisions taken by the counter-revolution was that to achieve its objective of defeating the ANC was to ensure that it fails in its task properly to govern our country. The second important and directly related decision was that the ANC had to be so weakened that it would not be able successfully to frustrate the realization of the first counter-revolutionary task that we have just mentioned. So in December 2007, the ANC held its 52nd National Conference in Polokwane in Limpopo. One of the tasks of the National Conference, like all others, was to elect the National Executive Committee, the NEC, which was done. Having taken the decision to weaken the ANC, the counter-revolution started already in 2002 to work on the task to change its leadership. The 2007 National Conference presented the counter-revolution with the opportunity to implement its plans in this regard. It therefore participated both in the preparations and the conference itself to ensure the success of those it favored as members of the NEC National Executive Committee. In this regard, I must mention a very important matter concerning the reality about South Africa, which we're discussing. This is that the apartheid regime had paid a lot of attention to the task to infiltrate as many of its agents as possible into the ANC and the rest of the broad democratic movement. Though much was done by the ANC to discover and expose these enemy agents, the hard reality is that a considerable number of these remained undetected within our ranks. So quite early after the formation of the 1994 Government of National Unity, we approached the heads of the SADF, the Defense Force, South African Police and the NIS, National Intelligence Service, to request that they give us a list of these agents so that we could discuss with and demobilize them. And effectively, all three services turned down our request. The counter-revolution used these agents in the ranks of the ANC to intervene in the Polokwane National Conference as it did. And later we'll return to this important matter of the place of the ANC in the context of the counter-revolution. You will recall that earlier I said that there were two reasons for the radical change between Dr. Andres's ages 1 and 2, the one economic and exogenous, and the other political and endogenous. In terms of the latter, I was referring to the change in the leadership of the ANC engineered by the counter-revolution, one of the major events during these first 30 years of our democracy. I will now discuss another important event which occurred during this 30-year period. I'd like to believe that nobody would contest the assertion that governance in any country would face serious challenges if denied access to state revenues, electricity, and a properly functioning economy. The South African Revenue Service, SARS, accounts for 95 to 98% of state revenues. From age 1 into age 2, Dr. Andres's ages, SARS outperformed itself in terms of revenue collection, with each year being better than the one before. However, this changed from the 2014-2015 financial year, with SARS underperforming in an ascending manner in the following years. Alarmed at this development, which meant an ever-shrinking pool of state revenues, President Ramaphosa appointed a Judicial Commission of Inquiry into SARS, empowered to make the necessary recommendation to address whatever shortcomings the Commission might have unearthed. Led by Justice Robert Nugent, this became known as the Nugent Commission. It submitted its final report to the President in December 2018. To cut to the bone, the Nugent Commission made the startling finding that some people had set out to destroy SARS. And it explained in detail how this was done. And obviously, the destruction of SARS would mean the destruction of the democratic state, given its unique place in terms of the provision of state revenues. It was exactly the success of this process of destruction which had resulted in the escalating underperformance of SARS from the financial year 2014-15, which set off the alarm, obviously contrary to the wishes of those who wanted to destroy the service. And one of the things which stood out in the Nugent Commission report, was the role that the well-known US business consultancy, Bain & Company, had played in planning and participating in the attempted destruction of SARS. The Commission also detailed the extensive process of consultation which had taken place between Bain and then President Jacob Zuma. President Zuma himself had appointed the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into State Capture, which was led by Justice Raymond Zondo and was therefore called the Zondo Commission. This commission also looked into SARS, building on the work already done by the Nugent Commission. And here let me quote some of what the Zondo Commission says. Quote, "The SARS evidence is a clear example of how the private sector colluded with the executive, including President Zuma, to capture an institution that was highly regarded internationally and render it ineffective. All these actions and events aimed at dismantling SARS cannot be coincidental. This is especially so in the light of the planning document which the Commission has been shown. The only feasible conclusion is that the organization was deliberately captured, and President Zuma and Mr. Moyane was the CEO of SARS, the head of SARS. The only feasible conclusion is that the organization was deliberately captured, and President Zuma and Mr. Moyane played critical roles in the capture of SARS and dismantling it in the way it was done during Mr. Moyane's term as commissioner. It is a notable feature of the SARS evidence, in contrast to the rest of the evidence which the Commission had, that this is one of the few instances where President Zuma was himself directly and personally involved in the activities and plans to take over a government entity, namely SARS. Another was ESCOM, which is discussed elsewhere in this report, unquote. Obviously, this confronts us with a conundrum. Here, according to the judicial commissions, we have a head of government who joins a process to reduce the very revenues he needs to enable the government to discharge its responsibilities, up to the point of the possible collapse of that government. So how do we explain this puzzle? The only logical way to explain it is that, challenging as it might be, even to comprehend, here we're dealing with a wolf in sheep's skin. Accordingly, in terms of this, I said it's only logical way to explain it. Accordingly, in terms of this logic, the involvement of such a wolf, so to speak, in the effort to destroy SARS would not be surprising, as it would represent the discharge of its responsibilities as part of the counter-revolution. And time will tell whether this logical deduction is in fact correct. To conclude this section, it's important to note that President Ramaphosa acted on the recommendation of the News and Commission to remove the then head of SARS, Mr. Tom Moyane. He appointed a new head of SARS, Mr. Edward Kisvetter, under whose leadership the service has largely recovered the competencies it had lost under Tom Moyane. Let me now address another important matter. Virtually no country in the world, including ours, can function properly without electricity. It would therefore be obvious that to realize its objective to ensure the failure of an ANC-led government, the counter-revolution would do its best to compromise the supply of electricity to democratic South Africa. There is a particular false narrative that has attended the electricity crisis which has affected our country for some years. And that narrative says that ESCOM warned the government as early as 1998 that if no immediate steps were taken to build new generation capacity, the country would suffer from serious load shedding from 2007. It is then said that government ignored this alert and that it is this failure on the part of government which lies at the base of the energy crisis that has affected our country for some time. As I've said, this is a false proposition, advanced to hide the reality in terms of what has negatively affected the availability of electricity at various moments. Some among us will recall that in 2007, speaking as the then head of government, I apologized on behalf of government for the instances of localized load shedding which had taken place, and continued in the same vein in 2008 after the first instance of national load shedding in January of that year. With regard to the latter, it was only 11 years later, in 2019, that we discovered that our apology had been misplaced. This was because the January 2008 national load shedding was completely unnecessary and had been deliberately engineered from within ESCOM and had absolutely nothing to do with any failures on the part of government. In 2017, a Special Investigation Unit and SIU submitted a report to then President Jacob Zuma entitled On the Investigation into the Affairs of ESCOM Holdings SOC Limited. And among others, this SIU report said that ESCOM's executive management and board of directors did not heed warnings from the employees of ESCOM that ESCOM was facing a potential shortage of coal by December 2007. The declaration of an emergency could thus have been avoided with the exercise of reasonable care. The board of directors did not respond to warnings that the coal stocks were reaching dangerously low levels prior to January 2008 and that the threat of load shedding was a strong possibility, unquote. In other words, the national load shedding of January 2008 took place because the managers of the power stations did not replenish coal, despite warnings from inside ESCOM to do so. Simply, the ESCOM station managers had defied instructions to replenish their coal stocks until they literally ran out of coal at many of the power stations. This was a deliberate attempt to compromise the supply of electricity. At the beginning of 2004, the government issued the directive that ESCOM had to build new power stations, and two of these were Medupi and Kusile. And over the years, regular ESCOM communications have reported that it started building Medupi in 2007, 3 years after the government directive. This report is incorrect. and tries to hide some bitter truth. The reality is that Eskom started building Medupi much earlier than 2007. And the truth is that the company or companies commissioned to prepare the site for the building of the power station did not do its geotechnical work properly. The result is that when construction started, the building sank into the soil. Construction had to stop. What had been built had to be destroyed, and work had to start afresh to prepare the site for construction. At some point, Eskom appointed the law firm Dentons to carry out a forensic investigation of the company to help it overcome its challenges. And with regard to this matter of failure to prepare the building site properly, this is what Denton says, quote, "This led to changes in the foundations which caused significant cost increases and substantial delays of the order of 12 to 18 months. So the building of this new generating capacity was delayed by that period of time because of the wrong things that were done with regard to preparing the site for construction. Here was a deliberate attempt to delay the building of the new generating capacity. And during February 2023, last year, the then Eskom CEO, Mr. Andre de Ruyter, submitted an affidavit to the Pretoria High Court, the Gauteng High Court in Pretoria, and among others said correctly, quote, "In 2005, Eskom had not built a new power station for approximately 16 years. Eskom had significantly reduced its skills and capacity to execute mega construction projects, such as Kusile and Medupi. Strangely, however, instead of awarding 10 key contracts for the building of the new power stations, Medupi, Kusile, and Ingula, Eskom awarded 34 contract passages at Medupi, 46 contract packages at Kusile, and 27 such packages at Ingula." And here is what Denton said about this, I quote, "A decision was made by Eskom to execute the Medupi-Kusile projects on a multi-contract basis rather than structuring the projects on the basis of a minimum number of large contracts. This meant that the responsibility and risk of integrating and managing the overall project implementation was with Eskom. This decision, coupled with the shortage of the appropriate skills in Eskom to manage such a large complex project, contributed greatly to the new build projects being over budget and behind schedule," unquote. It was surely not difficult to foresee this negative outcome when, as Dentons put it, Eskom decided to execute the Medupi-Kusile projects on a multi-contract basis. And later I will come back to this important matter mentioned by Dentons of projects being over budget and behind schedule. If we discount the deliberately engineered 2008 national load shedding, the first national load shedding took place late in 2014 and persisted until August 2015. Largely oscillating between stages 1 and 2. This means that there was no load shedding for at least 6 years after the 2008 incident. The question is, what happened to end this happy situation? Once again, Dentons answers this question, saying that Eskom had been underspending on capital expenditure to maintain its generating equipment since 1999 to 2000. And that during the same period, Eskom had deprioritized maintenance. That Eskom paid no attention to the fact that generation plant of similar age in other parts of the world was very significantly outpacing its own, demonstrating that it was not age which caused the underperformance of the Eskom plant. but the manner in which the generating plant had been operated, maintained, and refurbished. That was Danton's. And the ESCOM engineers knew very well that failure to do the right thing about the maintenance and refurbishment of generating plant would result in power failure. The practical result is that this failure contributed directly to the counter-revolutionary objective to compromise the supply of electricity to our country. The construction of Medupi and Kusile started in 2007 and 2008, respectively. And both power stations were planned to be commissioned in 2014, 7 and 6 years later, respectively. Contrary to this, 2 years ago, only 2 years ago, ESCOM expected that Medupi and Kusile would only be fully commissioned in 2023 and 2026, instead of 2014. The reality, therefore, is that if ESCOM had kept to the 2014 time frame, we would never had the power crisis we have been experiencing. The question is, what accounts for the inordinate delay in commissioning the new power stations? And this is the last example I will cite about the practical instances which have contributed to our energy crisis. One of the first major contracts awarded by ESCOM for the building of Medupi and Kusile was to the French multinational Alstom to supply the control and instrumentation C&I system, which is regarded as the brain of any power station. By December 2012, Alstom's C&I system, control and instrumentation system, had already failed the factory acceptance tests on the boiler protection system 3 times, a system that was critical to the commencement of the commission then of the first Unit 6 of Medupi. This led to further delays because the boiler protection system had to undergo substantial redesign. To cut this story short, in 2015, ESCOM announced that it had terminated Alstom's C&I contract for Kusile. It said the reason for that termination was that Alstom's power plant control system had not met the specified technical requirements, and in addition, would not meet the availability requirements prescribed during testing and installation. It awarded the contract to another multinational, ABB. It is clear that the problems of the C&I control and instrumentation system was as a result of a deliberate decision to choose a technically inferior solution from a supplier that had very little experience, if any, on commissioning such systems in the South African power stations. The inferior solution was chosen ahead of more technically suitable solutions from more experienced suppliers who had tendered relating to the South African thermal power stations. Here is an example of what caused the inordinate delay in the building of the new power stations. There are a number of other instances we can cite, all of them contributing to the objective to compromise the supply of electricity to the Republic. My last comment on ESCOM concerns the matter of the escalating costs. Medupi and Kusile had initial budgets of 79 billion and 81 billion, respectively. In 2020, the ESCOM board approved budget revisions to complete the power stations, giving 145 billion for Medupi and 162 billion for Kusile. That's double the budgets. And earlier in 2019, my broadband had estimated that the final true costs would be for Medupi 234 billion instead of 79. And for Kusile would be 460 billion instead of 81. And such is a measure of the escalation of the cost of the new power stations, which Dentons wrote about. In addition, concerning the shenanigans at ESCOM, we should not underestimate the similarly negative roles of sections of business and organized crime. And with regard to the foregoing, we can confirm that some of the interventions of the counter-revolution directly negatively affected the economy, while others helped to create a national atmosphere hostile to investment. The major business leader, Mr. Johan Rupert, reflected on this investment environment when he said in December 2018, and I quote, "We let President Mbeki down because he created a perfect scenario for business to invest. But you know what? I think we could not believe our luck. We should have invested more from the private sector during that period. Before foreigners invest, they look at us," unquote. Of course, there are other instances we can discuss concerning this destruction visited on our country by the counter-revolution in its determined effort to defeat the Rooigevaar represented by the ANC and its NDR. I'm talking here about such institutions as the South African Police Service, SAPS, National Prosecuting Authority, the NPA, Department of Health, and others across the board, including the state-owned enterprises. And earlier this month, in April 2024, this month, one of our communications media published an important article written jointly by advocates Shamila Batohi and Anton du Plessis, respectively NDPP and Deputy NDPP, National Director of Public Prosecutions. This article is entitled "Building a Fit-for-Purpose NPA is Crucial for South Africa's Future," and makes this important observation. It says in 2019, when the incumbent National Director of Public Prosecutions was appointed, South Africa was reeling from the effects of a decade of state capture, an attack from the inside, a stealthy and deliberate war waged on the rule of law by the very people whose job it was to protect it, unquote. And this observation about, quote, attack from the inside, a stealthy and deliberate war waged on the rule of law by the very people whose job it was to protect it, describes the act of counter-revolution. And in this regard, I recall some of the instances cited in Justice Mukoro's report about what the court has said about Advocate Jiba, for instance, that Jiba's conduct is inconsistent with the duty imposed on all public officials, functionaries, by Section 195 of the Constitution, to be responsive, accountable, and transparent. And that Jiba's stance is technically formalistic and aimed solely at shielding the illegal and rational decisions from judicial scrutiny, unquote. And the minority judgment of the Supreme Court of Appeal about Advocate Mkhwebi, also a member of the NPA, said, and I quote, "Mkhwebi lied about the events of both 5 and 9 December 2011 and abused his position. Not only has Mkhwebi shown himself to be seriously lacking in integrity, but has failed in these proceedings to take the court into his confidence and fully explain his actions. All of this hallmarks him as a person unfit to practice as an advocate," unquote. It is clear that whatever their own intentions, the wrong things which advocates Jiba and Mkhwebi did as members of the NPA serve the purposes, the objectives of the counter-revolution. And before we pass this reference to the NPA, it's important to note that President Ramaphosa used transparent processes to identify the new NDPP, to ensure that the right person was chosen effectively to address the recovery of the NDPP. The article I've cited asserts that this objective is being achieved. Let me cite one other instance relating to the state institutions, this time concerning the South African Police Service. Major General Benning Tlemeza was appointed head of the Hawks in 2015. However, this appointment was challenged on various bases, and ultimately the Pretoria High Court ruled in 2017 that this appointment was unlawful and invalid. And in this regard, the court said, among other things, quote, "The judgments are replete with the findings of dishonesty and malafidez against Major General Tlemeza." These were judicial pronouncements. They therefore constitute direct evidence that Major General Tlemeza lacks requisite honesty, integrity, and conscientiousness to occupy the position of any public office, not to mention an office as more important as that of the national head of the DPCI, the Hawks, where independence, honesty, and integrity are paramount qualities, unquote. It can therefore reasonably be argued that part of the process of disabling the SAPS by the counter-revolution would be the placement in positions of authority of such officers as Tlemeza. Before I conclude my remarks about the specific role of the counter-revolution, I must cite what the former deputy head of the apartheid South African Army, General Roland de Vries, said recently about the mayhem which took place in July 2021, largely in KZN and in Gauteng. And during an interview earlier this month, General de Vries was asked a question about what would happen in a situation where the state loses control of the stability of this country. And here is part of what he said. Quote, "In a sense, I would like to relate that to what happened in KZN in July 2021. On the 11th and 12th of July, if I can remember correctly, after Zuma was incarcerated, KZN started burning overnight. And brand new Range Rovers and BMWs without number plates, and people dressed in red t-shirts and caps just driving into the rural areas and the cities. And the plundering started overnight. And it was, to my mind, a well-orchestrated revolutionary threat which materialized as if by signal, as if by magic. Because it says it was, to my mind, a well-orchestrated revolutionary threat. I think it's counter-revolutionary threat, which materialized as if by signal, as if by magic. My question is, what is the capacity of the present government to contain a serious threat if security and stability are threatened? And the general says the government and the police don't have control over the security situation in our country, unquote. It was important that General de Vries made these observations about the destructive and criminal events of July 21, because they confirmed the estimates some had made about the deadly events of July 2021, that these constituted a practical exercise by the counter-revolution to test its ability to destabilize the country. And this is exactly why General de Vries expressed his concern about the capacity of the present government to contain a serious threat if security and stability were threatened. I can cite other examples illustrating the damage caused by the counter-revolution in the public sector. However, I believe that what I've said so far will suffice. I must also speak about the critically important decision adopted by the last two ANC national conferences that the ANC must renew itself as an absolute and urgent priority and for its very survival. The ANC conferences took this position as an acknowledgement that the organization itself was not in good health. And has been said repeatedly, essentially during the years since it assumed state power, the ANC has drawn into its ranks people who were only interested in getting into positions of power in government and abusing those positions for self-enrichment at all costs. And in time, some of those older members of the organization also adopted this stance. This represented a serious corrosion in the quality of some of the members of the ANC, leading to abhorrent behavior, such as embezzlement of public funds and other forms of corruption. And of course, we're talking here about the governing party. Therefore, it was inevitable that those who ended up in positions of state authority without the value system which was fundamental to the ANC would engage in activities directly opposed to the objective to serve the people. It would therefore be dishonest not to mention that some of the negative developments during our country's governance during the past 30 years were a result of negative actions taken by members of the ANC. Fortunately, the ANC itself has recognized the validity of the observation I've just made. In its latest and very important policy statement, the 2024 election manifesto, it makes some important and relevant commitments. Among others, it said, and I quote, "We admit we made mistakes as the ANC, with some members and leaders undermining institutes of the democratic state and advancing selfish personal interests. We are now raising the intellectual capacity and enhancing the moral and ethical orientation of our membership. And the living embodiment of a renewed ANC will be members who show exemplary conduct in society by upholding the core values and principles of selfless public service, discipline, and integrity," unquote. The manifesto goes on to make other commitments about such important matters as strengthening the links between government at all levels and the people, ensuring that the ANC public representatives and employees are held accountable for the basic services to communities, about strengthening investigation and prosecution capabilities, conducting rigorous lifestyle audits and improving vetting procedures, ensuring that there are severe consequences for corrupt activities. And they make a commitment to building a capable, developmental and ethical state led by honest, dedicated, and capable leaders. During the 30-year period we are discussing, the ANC has remained the single largest party, and I believe that whatever the outcome of the forthcoming elections, the ANC will still remain the largest political formation in our country as we begin our next 30-year period. This reality emphasizes the point that the ANC has an obligation truly to be guided by the principles of Batupili, whatever role it plays in the public domain, and that ways and means have to be made to make it genuinely accountable in this regard. This is why I've tried to detail the commitments of the ANC has made in its election manifesto with regard to the vitally important area of governance. I believe that one of the most important lessons we must learn from these first 30 years of democracy in our country is that any political party given the responsibility to govern in any sphere of government must practically be held accountable in terms of such good governance principles and policies as the ANC has listed in its election manifesto. And I'm convinced that is one of the common objectives we must carry forward as a people as we take whatever steps to define the South Africa we want. And during his address to the nation a few days ago on Freedom Day, 27th of April, President Ramaphosa pointed to some of the major challenges our country continues to confront. He says the apartheid legacy continues to define the choices and opportunities of so many South Africans. We know that despite our achievements, South Africa remains a highly unequal society. Our people confront every day the apartheid legacy of unemployment, poverty, and underdevelopment. Crime, especially crimes of violence against women and children, are a scourge in our communities. Despite great progress, many households do not have electricity or clean water. There are still many families that go hungry. There's a huge divide between the rich and the poor. We see this divide in access to health care, in access to safe transport and proximity to services and work opportunities. At times, it seems that these challenges threaten to undermine the achievements we've made over the past 30 years, unquote. And without doubt, the President was very correct in the observations he made. Something must be done. My papers are stuck. Something must be done to address these challenges because we cannot afford that they continue to define our country. At the same time, our combined efforts must continue to focus on nation building, national and social cohesion. The South Africa which, as visualized in our Constitution, truly belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. We must build and entrench strong ethical foundations, which must make a critical contribution to the task to end scourges of lawlessness, violence against the person, including gender-based violence, as well as a pernicious individualism, which leads to looting, to corruption, and all manner of criminal abuse. And therefore, we must achieve a correct definition of our place in the world, so that once more we re-emerge as steadfast champions of Africa's renaissance and co-architects of the global human family, visualized in Agenda 2030 and Agenda 2063, in which no one is left behind. There are three messages I would request that we take with us arising from everything I've said. The first of these is that the charge that some make repeatedly, that the last 30 years of our democracy have been a disastrous period for our country and people, is entirely false and serves ignoble purposes. Rather, the achievements realized as the result of the efforts of our people as a whole during the first 13 to 15 years of our democracy demonstrate this vitally important consideration, that together we have the capacity to take this country to great heights. More than this, it makes the statement that regardless of our situation today, we will certainly enter into a new beginning, to resume the labor of love once more to build a winning nation, a people-centered and caring society. The second message is that the quality of leadership we elect to govern our country is of critical importance to the very survival and healthy development of the democratic rule and governance for which many of our people sacrifice their lives. This means that as we begin our journey into the next 3 decades of our democracy, we must elaborate the processes whereby we ensure that those who govern us abide by specified principles and practices of good governance, which must be binding on a non-partisan basis. This would condemn to the dustbin the notion and conduct according to which the fact of a numerical majority leads to a conclusion that this rewards a majority party with the freedom to engage in any government practices of its choice. My third and last message is that at the heart of many of the problems our country faces lies the brute reality of a counter-revolutionary intervention which began some years ago. And whereas the central objective of that counter-revolution was to defeat the ANC and its NDR program, its intervention has caused enormous damage to the country as a whole and visited much suffering to millions of our people. I believe that this situation makes it incumbent on our people as a whole to act together to address the harm caused by the counter-revolution, first of all by answering the question of what is to be done to undo the damage caused by that counter-revolution. In his Freedom Day address, President Ramaphosa said, quote, "We know that if we work together, if we harness the same spirit of unity that we did in 1994, we will surely overcome the challenges that he had mentioned." And history shows, he says, that by working together in pursuit of a common goal, we will succeed. We believe in a better tomorrow, and it is within our hands to shape our collective destiny, unquote. Consistent with this approach, I suggest that to respond to the enormous challenges created by the counter-revolution, our people should convene in a new and truly inclusive national dialogue to answer the question, what is to be done? Of course, that national dialogue would be held later this year after the general elections. In this regard, I must report that currently I am engaged in serious discussions with a number of our national foundations, because I'm certain that the country as a whole would benefit greatly from their collective voice on the matter of the national dialogue I've mentioned. I'm certain that during this coming month of May, it will be possible to present to the country as a whole a more detailed proposal concerning this proposed national dialogue. I would like to conclude this presentation by referring to an important document issued recently by some of our compatriots. I refer here to the document issued earlier this month by a collective of Afrikaner leaders headed Afrikaner Statement, which incidentally could be discussed at the national dialogue I've mentioned. I was struck by the statements these Afrikaner compatriots made in the statement that we want to stay here and contribute to the well-being of the country and all its people, that we're building to remain here, and that the past should not destroy the future for us all. It seems to me that this statement communicates a vitally important commitment I trust all of us share, that together we must contribute to the well-being of the country and all its people. It is exactly this spirit and the noble attitude which guarantee that working together, as President Ramaphosa said, that working together we will overcome. Thank you very much for your attention.
Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: African politics, economy, and increasing power. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.
Tell us what you think in the comment section. Like and share the video, and subscribe so that you don't miss any of our African videos. It's the best way to support us.